Hello and welcome to the first part of my introduction to the study of terminology. If you haven't actually heard this during class time, you might like just to pause and spend a few minutes on this first task to get you started. I'd like you to see if you can find the Chinese equivalents for those terms. Firstly, fibrillin. Secondly, Marfan syndrome, and leaving the necessary and sufficient cause until the end, just using the World Wide Web. That will probably, in effect, mean searching via Google. See if you can find the Chinese equivalents. And don't use Google Translate, by the way. Okay, so I will assume you've spent a few minutes doing that. So what I'm going to cover in this presentation, first of all, I'd like to show you the kinds of terminology resource that are available over the World Wide Web. And then secondly, during the session, I'd like to give you plenty of practice in experimenting with different resources and searching them for specific terms, and then also recording those terms in a manner that is clear and unambiguous in an electronic format. And then finally, I should like to introduce you to the study of terminology and terminology management. But first of all, you might be wondering what is wrong with specialized dictionaries. You may possess a paper dictionary, but you're not likely to own one which is specialized. So focusing, for example, on scientific vocabulary or economic or medical vocabulary. Such things exist and are indeed used by professional translators. However, they're bulky to carry around, which is inconvenient in this day and age, when one often wants to be able to work while on the move. They're also rather expensive, and they may well be incomplete. They probably won't contain every single term that you might find yourself looking for. Finally, specialist language tends to change and develop much more quickly than general language, so you may well find that a paper dictionary will date much more quickly than a general one. For this reason, use of web-based terminology work, which is what this session is going to focus on, can either entirely replace using paper dictionaries, or perhaps just supplement their use if you happen to own a dictionary. There's something very convenient about a paper dictionary, of course, if you're always going to be working in one place. But for the reasons I've just stated, they are not always going to solve every problem that you might come up with. So here's a screenshot of an online list of terminological databases, just to give you an idea of the amount of terminology that exists in different technical areas. The first one, it's a dictionary of military terminology. It has over 16,000 entries. Then the UN terminology database, as one would expect, that's quite big, and includes 85,000 terms. The last one, which is on civil defense and energy management, contains 9,000, so even relatively specialized areas are very rich in terminology. Not only that, but even everyday items, if one wants to talk about them in a technical context, require the knowledge of a large number of specialist terms. Take a look at this image of an ordinary door and the number of different terms you need to be able to refer to in order to talk about this door in the context of construction or house building or whatever. This presentation will cover, first of all, terminology and its study, and then we will be looking at the nature of terminology, and then finally the last section will be about what a terminologist does, and that is in fact an actual job description, or job title I should say. So firstly, terminology and its study. So there are three definitions of the word terminology. The first one is the one that I've been using, which is quite simply the vocabulary of a particular specialized field. However, terminology can also refer to the set of practices and methods used to collect, describe, present, store, and indeed retrieve terms. And this is known as terminology management. And there'll be more on terminology management next week. Finally, terminology can actually refer to an entire discipline that exists for the purpose of studying and documenting how terms are labeled, maybe in one single language or more frequently across a number of languages. In terms of the type of translation, I beg your pardon, the type of terminology work carried out by translators, some of it is monolingual, just to maybe create a list of terms in the source language, or find an equivalent term in the target language or whatever. But more frequently, translators will be involved in bilingual or sometimes even multilingual terminology work, creating a list of terms in the target language and then working out what the equivalents are. And these, of course, tend to be words and terms that you need to know in order to be able to translate a particular text properly. Okay, so now moving on to talk about the nature of terminology. And I'd like you to take a look at this table, which lists how three particular terms appear in 5 different languages. Now, those terms are the words for 3 different gases: oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen. And you'll see that in English, these terms are taken from ancient Greek, and they have specific meanings in ancient Greek, but they're all formed in a fairly logical way. So that English is not in fact using its own resources at all to create these terms, but it's relying on a classical language, the resources of this classical language to draw the elements from which will then make up these terms. This is not the case in other languages, for example, other European languages, and here I'm listing Polish and German and Russian. And in the case of these languages, what you see is that sometimes they will use their own resources to create a term. This is the case in all 3 German examples: Sauerstoff, Wasserstoff, Stickstoff. But in each case, they're formed by copying or calquing the Greek term used in English. In English, and you'll see that the meaning is similar. This happens to some extent in Polish and in Russian. In Polish, you get tlen, wodór, and azot, and in Russian, you get kislorod, vodorod, and azot. So 2 of these are formed on the basis of words already existing in the respective language, but another one has been borrowed from Greek. And then we move to Chinese, and the terms here are yangqi, qingqi, and danqi. And what we see happening here is that the first, in each case, the first character has been created specially for that term, but it's been created on the basis of existing characters. So different languages will create their terminology in rather different ways. In the case of English, many scientific and medical terms are derived from ancient Greek and from Latin. And if you look at some of these roots, you'll see that, for example, haima, which means blood, is used in medical terminology. Anything beginning with hemo will refer to blood. Ophthalmos means eye, from which we get the word ophthalmic or the word ophthalmologist and so on. And frequently, words from Latin are used instead. such as pulmo meaning lung, pulmonary, like a pulmonary disease is disease of the lung, and so on. According to a scholar called Kasselman, vast proportions of English scientific and indeed medical vocabulary are created on the basis of Latin or ancient Greek roots. In fact, he argues that they account for as many as 90% of technical terms in those areas. I'd like now to talk about terminological relations. Now, this is something you're going to have to get to grips with as you work on your first assignment, because I'm asking you to link some of the terms that you're going to collect with each other in terms of how they relate to each other. Now, to start with a fairly simple one, you're all familiar with the concept of synonymy, when two or more words have the same or have similar meanings. The opposite of that is antonymy, when words have opposite meanings. But then we can move on to other, perhaps less well-known terminological relations, such as hyponymy, which refers to the situation when one term is much more general than another. So a building and a block of flats. A block of flats is a type of building. A series of hyponyms, each getting more specific, could be referred to or could belong to a broader structure, which is referred to as a taxonomy. So in the context of biology and the classification of different creatures, different plants or whatever, you start with a kingdom, like the animal or the plant kingdom, and then you home in on smaller and smaller categories of animal or plant. So kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Then we move on to meronymy, which is a bit like hyponymy, but while hyponymy refers to one thing being a type of another, meronymy refers to one thing being a part of another. So the palm of your hand, the palm is part of the hand. And then we can talk about various types of hierarchy, so that you can have a string of terms which could be hyponymous in relation to each other, or meronymous, or sometimes slightly different. So we have a hillock, I beg your pardon, we have a mountain, then a hillock, then a mound of decreasing size. And then we have food and cake as a type of food, and then a mooncake, I suppose seasonally appropriate at this time of year. A mooncake is a type of cake. Going on, there is something called homonymy, which you may be familiar with. This is when you have different words which either look the same, sound the same, or both look and sound the same. The term homophony is used to refer to terms that sound the same but don't necessarily look the same, and homography refers to the opposite, terms that look the same but don't necessarily sound the same, as would be the case in the latter pair of examples, read and read. Then you have polysemy. This is different from homonymy. In the case of homonymy, you have different words either sounding or looking the same. In the case of polysemy, what we have is one word with several different meanings. So a solution as in answer to a problem, and a solution, a liquid in which something has been dissolved. If you look in the reference section, there's a work by the Spanish scholar Muñoz, and that work mentions or goes into the idea of terminological relations in greater detail. Now these I've shown you in these two slides can be thought of as standard lexical relations, so they don't just refer to terminological items. On the other hand, the ones I'll be looking at in a minute are more specifically to do with terminology. But just before we move on, Some of you might know or be studying more than one European language, or may indeed be going on to study another at some point. If you do so, then you have to be very careful about the concept of synonymy, because words which appear to be similar or have the same meaning do not necessarily do so. You might have heard the term false friends, and that refers to words which look the same, but in fact are not the same. So those were some relations which are sometimes referred to as lexical relations, because they exist in a broader way than simply being referring to terminology. Here are some others which are more specific to terminology. So these might include the relationship between a producer and a product. And the reason it's sometimes useful to note these down is that you might, as the user of a term base, you might know the word bread, but you don't know the word of someone who produces, who makes bread. Now, of course, you do in real life. It's a hypothetical example, but you could, by using a term base, you could start from bread, and you would be told that the word for somebody who produces bread is a baker. Sometimes you can get that information from a dictionary, but it's not presented in a systematic manner. Similarly, you might find that actions and their results are noted, or actions and the tools that perform such an action, or containers and their contents, or indeed causes and effects. Okay, so these concepts, and indeed many more, are often linked with each other in a term base. Here's an image which illustrates this in a slightly more graphic manner. You'll see this one is focusing on the term hormonal therapy. And it shows how all the other terms round the edge refer to it. So you can see in the top left-hand corner, progestin, it says, is a hormonal therapy. So it's a type of hormonal therapy. In other words, it's a hyponym. And hormonal therapy is given to control cancer. So that's a very specific terminological relation. Hormonal therapy changes hormone level, and so on. And there's nothing particularly special or central about the term hormonal therapy here. It just happens to be the subject of this particular diagram, and it would indeed be possible to create similar diagrams for any of the other terms on the edge. Okay, now in English, and indeed in probably every other language, while you can sometimes have verbs or indeed adjectives and adverbs which would count as terms, almost all the terminological vocabulary in a particular specialist area tends to be made up of nouns. The figure I have here is 80% of a field's terminology. Although that figure may in fact be much higher in many cases, but at least 80% will be likely to be nouns. All the examples listed in the image here are, of course, nouns. Terms can either consist of a single word or of 2, 3, 4, or even more words, in which case one talks about multi-word terms or multi-word items. And of course, some terms are expressed as abbreviations or acronyms. In the case of multi-word items, the part of speech structure is quite interesting. Generally, or very often, a two-word term would consist of a noun plus another noun. And then for longer terms, you could have noun plus noun plus noun, or indeed noun plus noun plus noun plus noun. An alternative structure for a two-word term might be adjective plus noun, and then you can get adjective plus noun, or adjective plus noun plus noun plus noun. And there are a few other permutations as well, I think. Okay, so for the last part, I'd like to consider briefly what a terminologist actually does. This is a job description for an associate terminologist in the International Criminal Court. If you'd like to spend a few seconds just skimming through it. But as you'll see, the main tasks required of this person would be to monitor documentation and keep up to date with any changes or developments as they creep in. Be prepared to create new legal terminology, to ensure that terminology is standardized, and to answer any terminological queries that people working in the International Criminal Court might have, and so on. So that's a real job advert, and it actually pays quite well. 48,000 euros, tax-free, is not bad. Unfortunately, this is now closed, this particular advert, and indeed it has been for quite a number of years. But it's to give you an example of the sort of work that is associated with this type of role, which may possibly be of interest to one or two of you. In terms of the translator, all translators have to do terminology work in order just to find out the meaning of words in a new text they happen to be translating. So it's more on the basis of what's sometimes called ad hoc problem solving. And this Latin phrase refers to doing something without a plan as the need arises. So how do I translate condition for sufficiency into Chinese? The terminology work that translators do, therefore, tends to be text-driven rather than driven by an entire subject field and the aim of producing an exhaustive term base to cover an entire field. Translators, in order to be able to do their terminology work effectively, will need to have trusted sources of terminology, whether those are paper dictionaries or resources online, which of course is what we're focusing on. And they need to be able to record the terminology they find in a reliable way and be able to get back to it when they need it. In other words, to have appropriate, effective retrieval methods. Terminology work will take up a large proportion of your time as translators. In next week's presentation, I go into that in a little bit more detail. Now, there are a range of different sources for terminology or terminological information on the web, and we're going to cover these over the first 2 weeks of this course. So the first of these would be ready-made specialized dictionaries, glossaries, and term lists, and lexical.com is quite a good starting point to access some of these. So that's what is being covered in week 1. And then week 2 will cover points 2 and 3, which is first of all monolingual target language text or bilingual source language target language parallel text in the relevant area. But what the second week will be focusing on perhaps more is how to develop strategies to conduct an open-ended creative search for a particular term in the target language which you're having difficulty locating other ways. A term-based entry may be a very basic thing. It may just have information about the source term and the target term, and that could be enough. It might also have just a notes field for writing down anything, recording anything you think is important. Like how sure are you that it's correct, or what the URL is, where you got it from, and so on. And in the case of translation work, that's generally as far as a translator will be likely to go. But more sophisticated, more detailed entries might also include some of the following fields, such as equivalents in more than two languages, and definitions, one definition or maybe one definition for each language, grammatical information, details of the source, as I mentioned, the terminologist's level of confidence, and sometimes also images, pictures can be useful to include, pictures of the thing that, the concept, the object that is being referred to by the term. Ad hoc terminology management, so as I mentioned, as the need arises, involves identifying terms that need to be translated, terms that you don't know, and then creating starter entries. And then, as I said, a translator will often stop there because that's frequently all that translators need to do and indeed have time to do. But sometimes it's useful to make a note of the precise context in which you found the term. Sometimes it's useful to go beyond that and research the general context in which the term occurs. And this would definitely be falling within the job description of a terminologist, to reconstruct the entire concept system with notes on how terms relate to each other and so on. In terms of problems that translators can face in terminology work, one of the main ones is that translators are not necessarily specialists in the subject that they're translating, although if they work on a particular subject for a long period of time, they gradually do get to build up a quite substantial specialist knowledge. Secondly, a translator might not even be sure what field a particular text that they've been asked to translate will belong to. Sometimes their research materials are inadequate. Of course, what we're covering, I'm hoping that will meet that particular problem. Sometimes translators don't have access to subject specialists whom they email and ask if they get stuck. Usually I may say, translators don't have enough time to do as much research as they would want to, and certainly may not have time to create the kinds of extensive entry that I was referring to in the previous slide. So there we are. These are just some terminological resources or articles and so on about terminology, just for your further information. Thank you very much.